Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. To those of you who are here in person, it's great to see you. To those of you online, we're so delighted you can join us this evening for this very important conversation about the ever unfolding events between Israel and Iran. We are so lucky. I'm actually going to use the word blessed to have Dr. Richard Haass as a member of our community. Not only is he a member of our community, but he's so generous with his time and sharing his thoughts and his reflections, not only on days when our stomachs are empty, but even on nights like this when our stomachs are full, but our hearts are, our minds are curious. So this evening's dialogue, we're beginning now. We will end promptly at 7. Some of us have registered to go to an event after this, sponsored by UJ Federation at KJ. And so this event will be addressing our intellectual side, but a lot of us have a lot of emotions. So for those of us who are going over to KJ, there will be some opportunity to share with others in song and prayer, and working through some of those as well. But this evening, to get started, we're delighted to have Dr. Richard Haass, as I said, a member of our community. He's a veteran diplomat and respected scholar of international relations. He's President Emeritus of the Council of Foreign Relations after having served as CFR's president for 20 years. He's also a senior counselor with Centerview Partners, an international investment banking advisory firm. Confirmed by the U.S. Senate to hold the rank of ambassador, Dr. Haass has also served as a U.S. coordinator for foreign policy towards the future of Afghanistan and the U.S. envoy to the Northern Ireland peace process. As a Rhodes Scholar, Dr. Haass holds a bachelor's degree from Oberlin College and a master's and doctorate of philosophy degrees from Oxford University. He is the author or editor of 14 books on American foreign policy, 1 book on management, and 1 on American democracy. And he's also the author of a weekly newsletter, Home and Away, published on Substack. Thank you for being here with us. And of course, Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove needs no introduction, so I'll leave it to the two of them.
Thank you, Rabbi Kaufman.
Would you like an introduction?
I need, no, no. But Dr. Haass, thank you, as Rabbi Kaufman said, and thank you to Rabbi Kaufman and the entire team for putting this evening's program together on very short notice. As Rabbi Kaufman said, right now for the next hour is for the head. Those of us who have pre-registered for the solidarity convening with all the other communities, that begins at 7:30 p.m. immediately or soon thereafter. Dr. Haass, it's always good to see you. I see you in the pews all the time, but if I see you on this bima, it means it's either Yom Kippur or there's a crisis in this world, and we are certainly in a crisis moment. This evening's hour is billed as making sense of the moment, a briefing on Israel and Iran. Just to give it away, there are no surprises. What I'd like to do in these next 45 minutes before we open it up to questions is roughly ask how we got to this point, where things stand now, and how things could evolve from here. And then we'll open it up to all sorts of questions. So I'll begin with 2 words with a question mark. Why now? What precipitated Israel's attack on Iran's nuclear facilities now?
Why now is a 2-word question, so you think I could give a 2-word answer, but I can't. It'll take a bit more than that. First of all, good to be here with this community. It's an important time. Plus, there's no pressure today. I figure if people don't like what I have to say, you can go out and have a drink afterwards. Yom Kippur, there's much more pressure. So this is relatively simple, but a serious time. Look, why now is not a simple question. Actually, there's a good Old Testament quality to this. In the Old Testament, there's literature about different kinds of wars, and actually take about commentary on the Old Testament by Maimonides. And Maimonides speaks about wars that the king had no choice but to undertake, and wars of discretion, essentially wars of choice. And I would argue that in this case, this was a war of choice by Israel. Doesn't mean it's good or bad. It just is a war in which Israel had other options. It hadn't exercised this one until now, which suggests there were other options. I want to circle back to that. The Prime Minister of Israel said that there was new information that Israel had, one way or another, garnered. Not clear what it was. It hasn't been made public. So it could be that there was new information about what Iran was either doing or likely to do. Could have been also a new assessment. Sometimes in intelligence, what matters is not a specific dot, if you will, but a connection. So it could have been that. I also think the context lent itself to it because of what Israel has done over the last, year and a half, since the horrific events of October 7th. The weakening, in April and October of last year of Iranian air defenses, the devastation, decapitation of Hezbollah, the military weakening of Hamas. It had created a context where essentially it could act with tremendous military freedom over Iran. A few days before Israel acted, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is the international watchdogs, if you will, of the nuclear non-proliferation process, issued a report that was quite worrying and basically said the Iranian government had not been forthcoming. And there were various activities going on that were at variance with previous declarations of theirs and their obligations. What we know is that Iran had done several things. It had accumulated a large amount of what's called highly enriched uranium. Uranium can be intensified, concentrated, and you have to get up to very high levels to have the sort of stuff that goes into bombs. And Iran hadn't reached that point, but it had gotten relatively close to it. It had done, if you will, most of the work. It'd be like running a marathon and being at the 23-mile point. They had done most of the work to that, a large amount of it, plus their ballistic missile inventory by this point was large and growing. So for all these reasons, I believe that Israel wanted to respond. There's other possibilities. One is several people have put forward the theory that they were uncomfortable with the diplomacy that the United States was carrying out with Iran, and were worried that a deal might happen that wouldn't satisfactorily take into account their interests, that it would leave Iran with enough material or enough leeway that would be dangerous. There's those who think there were political aspects, that this government of Israel, this prime minister, shall we say, was looking for something that would distract attention away from other things, including Gaza, including the debate over democracy. And it should be pointed out that this is an issue that Israelis who can't agree on anything else, they can agree on. This is one of those issues that people who hate or love Gaza policy, who feel that Israel, the courts sort of have a big role or a little role in Israel. This is something that a lot of Israelis come together on. And in my experience in life, there's multiple reasons that people do what they do, but I think some combination of those things is why Israel elected to act now.
And one of the most interesting things that's happened in my mind is not what's happened, but what hasn't happened. Meaning Hezbollah, Hamas.
Yeah.
There have been, there maybe from the Houthis some, but nothing that's been a game changer. The Gulf states, the reaction of the region, which, as you point out, is really a reflection. Syria is no longer Syria. The neighborhood has changed in the last 18 months.
Dramatically, and that's again revealing. It's so much of Iran's defense and their national security policy depended upon their proxies. And if you think about it, Hezbollah was their principal proxy. And the idea that was all the rockets that Hezbollah had, somewhere between 100 and 200,000, the whole idea is that would hold Israel back. Because if Israel ever were to act against Iran proper, Hezbollah would be able to do all these things. Well, Hezbollah can't do those things now. So Iran had based a lot of its defense policy not on what it could do for itself directly, but on what its proxies could do. That turned out to be, in some ways, a deeply flawed strategy. And one of the interesting things, getting ahead of ourselves, will be whether people in Iran question this reliance on proxies. Because what we see in Iran's air defense systems are generations behind the kind of thing that Israel now is putting up against them.
Right. I want to come back to the distinction.
Oh, just I say one. I apologize.
Of course.
That you mentioned, and the lack of reaction in the neighborhood. No love lost for Iran. Which is not to say the Arab countries around Israel want to see a war or want to see escalation. They're obviously worried about their own energy installations and so forth. But there's no love lost for Iran in this part of the world.
Okay, I'm stuck because there are 8 questions coming out of my mouth at the same time. Let's stick with the Gulf states, the beneficiaries of this moment, whether it's Saudi Arabia, the UAE, whatever Syria is or isn't. These, that's not a Gulf state, but the point being one and the same of the beneficiaries of this moment. I think they each issued a pro forma statement decrying Israel's aggression, but then basically, best as I can tell, went on with their day. Is that also, and we...
No, pretty much true. And my hunch is they did the least they felt they had to do, perhaps to placate a degree of domestic public opinion. But again, look, the Middle East has changed a lot. You have the Abraham Accords, you've got Egypt, Jordan, others have, relationships with Israel. And again, a real appreciation of the Iranian threat, either directly from Iran or historically. I should have mentioned one other thing, which is, in some ways, it's so big, I should have mentioned it, which is the other reason the why now is Israel had been watching what Iran had been doing for years with its nuclear program with alarm. And as awful as October 7th was, and I don't diminish it in any way, it was not an existential threat to the state of Israel, as horrific and as terrible as it was. An Iranian nuclear weapon is potentially an existential threat. So I see in Israel, what was potentially happening was seen as a qualitatively different sort of challenge that was coming down the road. And let me just say one other thing, at the risk of getting wonky for a second. When I mentioned before, Israel did it was a war of choice. What Israel did is what's known in the literature as a preventive military attack, a military attack against a gathering threat. The Israeli government used the phrase preemptive military attack, which was reserved for imminent threats, and I think that was a misuse of the word. Curiously, it was the same misuse of words that George W. Bush did before the 2003 Iraq War. He called it a preemptive war when it was really a preventive war. And again, preemptive wars have greater standing in legality in terms of they're seen as a form of self-defense. Preventive wars against gathering threats do not have that same standing. They're more controversial.
Can I just check you on that?
Yes.
Because based on what you said 5 minutes ago, isn't it premature to weigh in on whether this was preventive or preemptive? Meaning you yourself said, we don't know what new information Israel had.
Yeah.
So historians may reflect on that distinction, but we don't have the luxury of
Here's
doing
why it's
that.
not inconsistent. Because even if we get information that Iran was reaching certain levels of capabilities, that's still different under international law than an imminent use of them. So in order to justify a preemptive strike, it can't be over capabilities. You have to have warning that a strike's going to happen. For example, a version of what happened just before the Six-Day War, that there's got to be a qualification there in order for it to technically count as preemptive. Again, it's a wonky thing, but I mention it because there'll be questions depending again what Israel produces in the way of intelligence, questioning the necessity of what they did. Some will question the legality. I actually think it's more of a policy question, and one could have a full discussion about the wisdom of it, and most likely that'll depend, the answer to which will depend in no small part upon how this plays out.
So to pull the camera back 10, 15, however many years, for my entire memory of the Netanyahu government, and probably other governments as well, the single greatest existential threat to Israel has been an Iranian nuclear bomb. So whether or not, why this weekend as opposed to another time, we'll find out in years to come. But you can't blame the prime minister. I mean, he's been true to his word that this has been the North Star threat to Israel. And I guess I'm now playing back all of the conversations in various administrations, Iran deal, no Iran deal, we should. I mean, how do you play back, or do the events of the last 48, 72 hours make you think through the various chapters of this story leading up to this moment?
I think something like this was probably inevitable. Yeah, for those of you who don't spend all your time reading Foreign Affairs magazine, which hurts me deeply, but look, there had been growing concern about Iran's nuclear-related activities. In 2015, the United States and other countries in Europe signed an agreement with Iran that put certain time-limited limits, 10 years for this, 15 years for this, on various aspects of the Iranian nuclear program. And all along, just to be fair, Iran said it was not interested in creating a nuclear weapon, though it never satisfactorily answered the question, if you're not interested in creating a nuclear weapon, why are you doing things you would not have to do if you're simply interested in nuclear activities for generation of energy? There was always a disconnect, shall we say, an inconsistency in the Iranian argument. In any case, there was this agreement in 2015, quite controversial, because to sum it up, I'd say it managed the problem, it didn't solve it. Or to use another word, it parked it for a while, for say 10, 15 years, various aspects of it. Became very controversial. When Trump 1.0, the previous Trump presidency came in, ripped it up. And so then Iran, rather than acting under certain constraints for roughly another decade, was then acting under no constraints. So that's one of the, and what they did was got to a point recently that they would not have gotten to had they continued to be under and comply with the 2015 agreement. That said, even if this agreement hadn't been torn up by Trump 1.0, at some point all of the ceilings would have expired. So we would have gotten to this point, if not now, in say 5 years or whatever. So I think this day was likely inevitable. I think part of the bet of the Obama administration when they signed the agreement was that over the period, the lifespan of this agreement, they thought that regime evolution, if not change in Iran, was a high possibility. So they thought this would park the nuclear problem. Meanwhile, you'd have internal social, political dynamics in Iran. And ultimately, the regime, to use an old word about the Cold War, would mellow. And then we wouldn't have to worry as much about capabilities. Needless to say, that didn't come to pass. But I do think this day was inevitable, given the nature of the Iranian program, the hostility between Iran and Israel. I mean, this ever since '79, the Iranian regime has in many ways defined itself as anti-Zionist and anti-American. Those have been the two motivating theologies or ideologies of it. And I think virtually, if you look at the Israeli political conversation, it's not just people of the quote-unquote political right. It's people of the political center, people of the political left, who feel extremely strongly about the actual or potential threat emanating from Iran. So I think this was a when, not if question, essentially.
Which brings me back to the more philosophically minded point, which is if it was a matter of when, not if, right, whatever that expression is, if someone keeps saying that they're going to kill you, right, at a certain point, believe them, right? It is a principle on which the Iranian regime is based, destroy the Zionist entity, death to America, right? For me, this is an expression of Israel's self-determination, right? To recast a bit what I said on Friday night to the community, do unto others before they do unto you, right? So it was a matter of time. Iran is a bad actor on the world stage, not to be trusted. Israel was taking care of itself in a way that it could.
You've gone farther than I would go, that I think you have to go. Look, during the Cold War, we had Nikita Khrushchev who said, "We will bury you." Soviet Union was dedicated to winning the Cold War and undoing the West. To me, you've always got to think about capabilities and intentions when you think about national security. Iran's intentions, at least rhetorically, were pretty clear. Whether they would actually act on them, question mark, and capabilities hadn't yet reached that point. And Israel had all sorts of options. You had, let me give you two other, at least. One is what they did. Another was what the United States was trying to do at the time, which was diplomacy, the 2015 agreement, and then now trying to come up with a new agreement. That's what the president and his special envoy, Steve Witkoff, were about. Another, the United States, when the Soviet Union developed nuclear weapons, our view was rather than carry out a preventive attack, which was discussed, in the late 40s and so forth. The United States chose deterrence. In principle, Israel could have done that. I'm not saying it would have been wise to, but Israel had a menu of options. So there was the question of when to act and how to act. And this is what foreign policy is about. They chose, in this case, to carry out an attack that really had two dimensions. One was or three dimensions. One was to continue to degrade military capabilities, air defenses, missile sites, whatever. Second of all, to go after the certain known nuclear-related installations like Natanz and other places, Isfahan. We'll talk later about Fordo. And then also to go after senior regime figures, which led a lot of analysts to conclude that Israel's goals were not just military, not just anti-nuclear, but also to promote regime change in Iran. Again, these things are not mutually exclusive, but that is what Israel in the end chose to do. But they did have, again, there's always options on whether to use force and then how to use force. And so that they chose to use force against this set of targets, but obviously they had other options.
So I want to go back to a cynical read of what's taken place, because I think it's important in the spirit of open dialogue to share different voices that I've heard expressed in the community, which is the single greatest goal of the Israeli government right now should be the return of the hostages. Period out. The living and the dead. And that what's happened in the last 72 hours has not brought that goal closer now. If anything, it's made it less likely. So to those in the community who might say cynically, either this was politically motivated or this was contrary to the stated goal. I mean, I was in the Central Park on Sunday at the Free the Hostages Now rally, and I have to say, it was very textured what was going on. On the one hand, supportive of Israel's right to self-defense, but on the other hand, saying, let's not take our eye off the ball. It's about bringing the hostages home.
So I hadn't heard that argument. So let me give you multiple reactions while I'm sitting here. One is national security. You never have the luxury to just focus on one thing. We have multiple threats out there, multiple challenges at any moment. So the idea that Israel has to choose between these two goals, to me, is just flat out wrong. One has to pursue getting the hostages back, as well as make sure that Iran does not pose an existential threat to Israel. As awful as the hostage thing is, I also say it is not I would say, an existential threat to Israel, without diminishing it, the awfulness of it in any way. Second of all, Israel has had 18 or 19 months of time, and still does have time, if you will, if it wants to make the hostages a priority, not for Israeli national security, but for Israel's approach to Gaza. And that's been a decision of this government not to do it. You may think that's wise, you may think that's terrible, but that's a fact. That has not been the priority of this Israeli government. Indeed, Israel chose not to implement the second phase of the Israeli-Hamas agreement, which would have brought the hostages back. Why? Because Israel didn't want to agree to an open-ended ceasefire and withdraw all of its military forces from Gaza. So Israel has had the opportunity to get the hostages back. It has the opportunity now to get the hostages back. And I don't think whatever it does vis-a-vis Iran's nuclear program or whatever, I don't see the two in some ways as forcing a trade. I think it should pursue its legitimate national security concerns vis-a-vis Gaza, vis-a-vis Iran, or anything else.
Okay, thank you. So what would constitute a victory here for Israel? You made mention of Fordo, regime change. What would actually...
Got it. It's a great question. And Israel has done something that's risky, which it has introduced the use of military force without a clear answer to that question. Or to put it a better way, it could answer that question in two ways. It just can't achieve it. Let me give you two possible answers to the rabbi's question. One would be the complete elimination of Iran's nuclear capabilities. Israel does not have the military means to do that. Full stop. Full stop. Second of all would be the overthrow of the Iranian regime. I remember when I worked with Colin Powell, and he used to say, look, I'm a military guy. I'm a simple military guy. We're good at two things. We're good at destroying things and killing people. Don't give me the order to get rid of a government, because I don't know how to do that militarily. You're giving a political mission to military forces. So Israel, if your goals are to de-nuke, if you will, denuclearize Iran or get a different government in Iran, neither one of those if the prime minister were to give those instructions, no Israeli general could salute and say, yes, sir, I will do that, because you can't assign those tasks to military forces in Israel right now. So that's a problem. So the question of what constitutes success. Now, another thing would be to keep Iran's proxies weak, keep the Iranian government on its heels, constantly whenever you have to attack, because you get some new intelligence about some new capability being developed. Essentially an open-ended state of vigilance mixed with military attack against Iran. So it's not, again, it manages the problem, if you will. It doesn't solve it, but it manages it at a level that the Israelis feel the threat is not immediate and existential. I think that's a definition of success the Israelis could achieve, potentially. I think that's achievable. It's just not satisfying. But I think that is achievable by Israeli military forces. But they have not answered that question. And I find it's quite interesting to go into a war without a clear answer to that question. I tend not to recommend it.
So let's bring in the American administration then,
Sure.
because you very carefully worded that Israel doesn't have the capability of accomplishing its goals, but America may have the capability of accomplishing those goals of bunker busting bombs,
Sure.
underground arsenals, all that. Where do you see the lead up to green lights given, and what are some of the possible moves of the American administration?
Yeah.
And of course, this is all happening in real time.
So in real time, probably since we've sat down, 16 things have changed. So forgive us. Look, the administration, this and previous administrations have been watching Iran warily. It's been bipartisan position that Iran should not be able to get a nuclear weapon. A little bit of lack of specificity or clarity of what's short of that ought to be tolerable. Because I always said, I want to make sure that Iran, it's not enough to say they don't get a nuclear weapon. I don't want them to be a week away or a month away. And big debate about what was tolerable short of that. But let's put that aside. And you had the 2015 agreement approach. You had sanctions. You had threats of military force. You then, clearly, this Israeli government felt a need to act for whatever set of reasons that we've discussed, or conceivably other reasons. Initially, the administration said no, give our negotiations time to play out. And then after roughly 2 months, for whatever reason, either the administration had decided that it politically didn't want to say no to Israel anymore, or had become persuaded that the talks with Iran were not succeeding. Maybe there was new intelligence. I don't know. The red light turned to another color. I don't know if it was yellow or green, but it turned to another color, as the Israelis clearly took that as acquiescence, or whatever, enough of a approval, what have you, acceptance to do it. And they did it. I think now, interestingly enough, the administration has a couple of big decisions to make, really big decisions. One is, the rabbi was suggesting, is whether the United States threatens to or actually carries out military attacks on those nuclear installations, above all the one at Fordo, that the Israeli military doesn't have the capability to reach. It's because it's deeply underground, all sorts of layers of protection. You need things like our B-2 bombers with these very large ordnance, so-called bunker busters, which have a kind of, they get rid of one layer of defense and then follow on immediately with other explosives. We would have to do that ourselves. It's not something we could transfer to Israel. So one question is, do we become a direct participant in the offensive side of the war, in addition to helping Israel defensively against Iranian missiles? Big question. We can talk about it, but that's one side. Second of all is whether we were to tell the Iranians, if you widen this war, for example, if you attack Saudi or other energy installations, shipping, whatever, that you go after American embassy, whatever, we will become a full participant in the war. Another question for this administration. And in both cases, there's the really interesting, what's the last shop? What's the relationship between military threats and diplomacy? Because if you're going to threaten the Iranians, you've got to say, but here's the off-ramp, here's your exit. However, we will not attack Fordo, or we will not do other things. Indeed, we'd even relieve sanctions if you were to do these things. So what's on the list of those things? For example, give up all your enriched uranium. Iran gave up its enriched uranium in the 2015 agreement. Funnily enough, it went to Russia. Would they, we'd have to decide who would get it, but that. What kind of inspections would they agree to? Basically, Iran would have to do those things that would satisfy us that they were legitimately out of the nuclear business. Could you ever be 100% sure? No. You can't get rid of know-how in people's brains, and you can't get rid of undisclosed hidden sites sometimes, because no government would let you crawl over every inch of their territory, and even if you could, you can't go in every warehouse and factory. So you would have to say we had minimized, and that we were, so anyhow, you would have to come up with a set of requirements for Iran that you would say, if you meet these requirements, we will not attack you, and so forth. And so I think the administration has to decide what the requirements are, basically a last chance at diplomacy, what they say to deter Iran from certain things, and what they threaten Iran with. So I think Mr. Trump, supposedly had that meeting today, President Trump has some really big national security foreign policy decisions to make about what he's prepared to do vis-a-vis this crisis.
We talked about not locally, but regionally, of escalation or not with Gulf states and otherwise. What about globally of this thing just going on? Is there any scenario that China, North Korea, Russia, that anyone could get involved at this stage?
I think it's unlikely. I mean, the idea that Russia offered to help, I found preposterous. One, Russia benefits from a crisis because energy prices go up. That's Russia's cash crop. If you read, this is the perfect place to say it. Chutzpah has rarely been on such full demonstration as the statement by the Russian Foreign Ministry about their criticism of Israel, about their unjustified attack on a sovereign state, and on and on and on. I mean, really? Really? From the Russian Foreign Ministry? Pardon me. So no, I don't think Russia, though again, it was curious to me that the president wants to make the G7 the G8 again, which again I find totally unwarranted. China wants to keep energy prices down. China, unlike Russia, is an energy importer, not an exporter. But again, I don't see China having a whole lot of sway. The answer is no in the short run. I think the scenario that gets interesting is if there's an open-ended war some way, if this thing is not resolved through diplomacy to our satisfaction, I worry potentially about a North Korea, possibly about a Russia, some other country helping Iran reconstitute its military or nuclear capabilities. Again, I can imagine scenarios where this is not neatly resolved. I mean, you could have diplomacy that succeeds, and then you could have non-compliance. You could have attacks on Fordo, and we could get rid of 90% of known Iranian nuclear capabilities. That still leaves 10% we couldn't get rid of, and that leaves the unknown. And so reconstitution, and that gets to the whole question of what is the consequence of military action against Iran, and we can talk about Iran in a minute, on the strength of this regime. So the hope or expectation that in days or weeks we're going to have clarity here may be an unmet hope. But again, I said, so President Trump has to make these big decisions. So does the leadership of Iran. They have to make decisions about whether they would be prepared to sign on to some diplomatic deal, that they would give up most or all of their uranium enrichment, nuclear weapons, nuclear activities. They would have to, at a minimum, they would avoid, the incentive is they would avoid getting attacked by the United States. They would have to give up the option of trying to widen the war. They could get some sanctions relief. But I think, to me, the most interesting historical parallel here is the one of the Ayatollah Khomeini in the late 80s, I think it was 88, if my memory serves me right, when he didn't want to end the decade-long war with Iraq. And he said he would do it. He said, this is like drinking poison to me, but I will drink it in order to save the revolution. So the question is whether the current leadership of Iran would accept an agreement that they do not like and even find humiliating in order to what they think would be the second time in their history, their post-revolution history, in order to save the revolution. And I don't know if they're at that point yet, but we may find out. So this is actually, Israel has played many of its cards. Love them, not love them, they've played them. The real question now is how the Americans and the Iranians play their hands. And I don't have the answers to that, but I think these will be historic decisions by what happens in Washington and what happens in Tehran.
Okay. I'm going to ask a couple more, and then we're going to open it up for questions. In your very busy emeritus retirement status, you've
yes,
you're the most anyway. You work in also the for-profit world and the effects of this moment on world economies, on energy markets, on...
You're not going to ask me for a contribution now, are you?
It is noted that you are now in the for-profit, not-for-profit status. How do I make sense of this, the potential outcomes of this moment? What's its effect been on world markets? What could it be on energy markets?
I mean, the two sets of markets. One is energy markets. I haven't seen what happened today. Sorry, I've been traveling actually to Texas talking about energy. But the price of oil is up since the crisis began, less than 10%. And by historic levels, quite low. I mean, $70 a barrel, particularly once you factor in inflation, this is pretty low stuff. So there's not been a massive, even though some energy-related installations have been hit in Iran. Stock markets have kind of shrugged it off. I mean, tariffs have had a much bigger impact on volatility in equity markets than has this war. Interesting. Now, it also, in energy, it reflects the fact that because of tariffs and some other phenomena, economic growth is way down globally. IMF and the World Bank have both lowered their figures. That demand, as a result, for energy is down. So there's a cushion, there's surplus in global energy markets right now. So if you're going to have a crisis and you don't want to see massive increases in energy prices, this is a good time because you've got a soft market. And again, there's been so much volatility introduced from other things. This is just one more thing. I mean, this is a funny moment where you're getting bombarded from various directions with all sorts of things outside of the normal earnings picture that drives equities. And this is just but the latest. And so far, at least, it hasn't escalated to, it's been local. As horrific as it's been, as intense as it's been look, and think about it, what happened with Syria, with Hezbollah, with Hamas, and so none of these things has really affected markets. The world's a different place now than it was, say, in '73. So so far, that's been mostly a shrug. But, that could change in some ways, but at the moment, it's mostly been a shrug.
Okay. My last question of these 20 questions, domestically speaking, the American Jewish community has historically been suspect, fearful, and on guard against an anti-Israel left, those for whom Israel can do no right. Of late, my concern remains on that same anti-Israel instinct, but I'm also worried about the Tucker Carlson isolationist far right. And I'm wondering, in this particular moment, certainly as Trump is listening to the various voices and the coalition that makes MAGA MAGA, should we not also be very, very concerned when it comes to America's support for Israel from this increasingly loud voice on the right?
Short answer is yes, for reasons that go beyond Israel. But no, I mean, I think the left is more sensitive to the situation in Gaza and the West Bank, and that's been animating the left. Now, it's selective indignation, I get it. I don't see it on Ukraine. I don't see it in Sudan. I don't see it on a million other issues, but I think the left is mostly focused on that. Yeah, the right, it's an interesting thing to parse, and I don't, whether, I mean, the right has sort of been pro-Russian to a large extent on the war in Ukraine. It is quasi-isolationist, or more than quasi at times. Some of it, though, has supported some of the muscular bullying, whatever you want to call it, in the Western Hemisphere. But that might be consistent with the kind of spheres of influence. We do this, the Russians have Europe, the Chinese have a... But like the Steve Bannons of the world are some of the loudest anti-China voices out there. So it doesn't line up neatly, but I hear you. And because the right has historically, shall we say, been involved with anti-Semitism, to say the least. And there is a strong, it's either minimalist or isolationist, which I think is dangerous for America. I think when I get up in the morning and I look at the world, I worry. Now, it doesn't mean that the answer is always military force, and I think at times, I use the phrase wars of choice. We've carried out wars of choice that have been truly unfortunate, including the Iraq War. Vietnam, one would argue, and so forth. We've overreached at times. So I think there's a danger in overreach that we've seen. There's also, though, a danger in underreach. Getting it right, that's the stuff of debates. But yeah, I think it's warranted to be worried. And it'll be interesting. That's why it'll be so interesting to see where President Trump comes out here about how he decides to play this situation. And I get a little bit nervous when people in general call for restraint. It's a little bit like peace. Whether it's peace in Ukraine or you restrain here, you never want to have peace or restraint at any price. So I want to have peace with Ukraine, but not at the cost of Ukrainian sovereignty and so forth. And I don't want to teach Russia and others that aggression pays. And I don't want to have restraint here at the idea that Iran can pose an existential threat to Israel. So yeah, I'm in favor of, we ought to be in favor of stable, secure, reasonable, fair, whatever word you want to use, outcomes. But I get nervous when I hear, if you will, unconditional calls for restraint. No, it's got to be conditional. Everything, it's got to be compared to what? And I just think we have to constantly ask that question.
Okay, thank you. Let's open it up. Short statements followed by a question mark with a bias towards young people.
I'm not sure we'll get a lot of questions.
No. Yeah, no, we're redefining what young means.
That's good. Okay.
Who's that? Ellie, is that in the back? Yes, please.
Hi, thank you very much. Just wanted to ask a little bit more about, your comments on starting military action without a plan for what was going to happen. I mean, obviously, it seems like there's a very strong parallel here with the previous Israeli decisions to destroy the nuclear programs in Iraq and Syria. And I would maybe just love to hear you flesh that out a little bit.
Those were also preventive military actions against those nuclear installations, but those were discrete installations. That wasn't war. Those were preventive strikes, if you will, against a reactor, against I think it was Iraq in Iraq, and the Syrian one. Those were strikes, and Israel did it, and it did it in ways also. It didn't jump up and down. Israel wasn't looking to do something larger. This was something. This is war. This is not a strike. This is a war. Again, it's preventive, but it's a war, and it's a much larger set of targets. Was much larger. You had 200 or so aircraft involved rather than 1 or 2 aircraft. So this is qualitatively different, and also the potential. Well, I was put it this way: the degree of capability that Iran had amassed was qualitatively different than what either Iraq or Syria had amassed. This would have been like Iran decades ago. I mean, compared to the other thing, would have been Iran decades ago, not Iran now. So I think it was a much larger set of capabilities, multiple installations, known, who knows about, by definition, the unknown. a large amount of enriched uranium. So Iran was generations ahead of where either Iraq or Syria. What Israel did in the other two cases was kind of nip them in the bud. This was way beyond that, and it took something much larger militarily to do it. And then obviously Israel had other objectives here as well, I think, weakening the Iranian leadership.
Thank you. Yes, Vicky.
Thanks so much for coming. I have two questions. One, I read in the past that America had lent the B-52 to an ally. Do you think there's a possibility that they may lend it to Israel to destroy the nuclear capability? And the second question is, how likely do you think a regime changes in Iran?
The former, I'm not familiar with that, but I don't know that any Israeli pilots have trained on those aircraft. It might also have to be B-2s rather than B-52s. No, I think, let me give you one piece of historical thing, because I was slightly involved in it. I think the United States faces a big question, and it's a tough one. But we had a similar moment 30, 40 years ago. I have to get my dates right. I think it was in the 80s, 90s. I'm sorry, I think at the latest it was in the 90s. It may have been early, with North Korea. There was a moment early on in the North Korean nuclear program where North Korea had these fuel rods, they're called, which is part of the process, and they were taking them out of these what are called cooling ponds, literally things to keep them from getting too hot and going at a level of radioactivity that would set off a mini reaction. And they were going to be vulnerable when they did this, before they could put them somewhere underground that we couldn't monitor or reach. And there was an interesting conversation about whether we attacked North Korea then, to basically nip their nuclear program in the bud. And we held back for the simple reason that we were afraid if we did so, we would have triggered a North Korean attack on South Korea and the Second Korean War. And we had tens of thousands of US troops there and a security commitment and so forth. So we avoided taking out the North Korean program then at the risk of what we now have, which is a North Korean program of what, 50 nuclear weapons and who knows how many ballistic missiles. So this has become a massive threat, not just to South Korea and Japan, but potentially to ourselves. So I think if we feel strongly enough about that, and we should, that Iran should not be allowed to have certain capabilities. And if we can't get the acceptable diplomatic outcome, then I think this is more than Israel's fight. I think that's something the United States should be prepared to step up to. It's not without its drawbacks and other considerations, but to cut to the chase and not take a long time. I think that's something that I think there's a pretty good argument for doing it. Regime change, your second question, it's impossible to know. You know, it's like, who knew that the Soviet Union was going to fall when it fell? I mean, I sure didn't, and I was in the White House at the time. And the CIA wasn't predicting it every day. Certain people said, you know, there's signs of weakness, there's this, there's that, but it's a little bit like it only seems somewhat more obvious in hindsight. And so my hunch is we don't know. We don't know enough about the dynamics inside Iran right now. Let me say one other thing. We not only don't know if this regime is, if you will, ripe to fall, how close is it to the precipice, we don't know what would take its place. And, you know, we've seen in other countries, like in Libya and elsewhere, when the ancien regime falls, what comes is not necessarily, in this case, you wouldn't necessarily have, 80 million Iranians reading the Federalist Papers in Farsi. Maybe, but not necessarily. And but in any case, I don't think you can base a foreign policy on it. That's my view. And so if you can try to promote it, you can try to be ready for it, to encourage certain outcomes. But I don't think an Israeli prime minister or an American president can say, this is our strategic objective, and we're going to do X, Y, and Z to bring it about. I don't think that's possible.
Okay. I think we have, yes, sir, all the way up front.
We hear about how long it's going to take for Iran to actually develop a nuclear weapon. I would think it would be a similarly difficult situation to deliver it. What's the situation with doing that?
It's a good question.
And is it even possible? Because Israel shoots down like 95% of what comes over.
Okay. I mean, so Iran has come close to having the enriched uranium. It turns out, at the risk of saying more than I understand myself, Iran has enriched uranium, say, to 60, 70%. To get to 90+%, it's not, they've already done 90% because of the algorithms of what they got to do. So they're close. No doubt they could have enough enriched material for a half dozen, a dozen, whatever bombs. That's not the issue. What we seem to know less about is the weaponization side of it. Nuclear weapons require usually compression, blah, blah, blah. Anyhow, I'm not an engineer, as you've already figured out. We don't seem to know exactly how close the Iranians are. That's the kind of thing that they could do in hidden laboratories. We just don't know. It's also the kind of thing that others could help them with. North Korea, Russia. So again, there may be new intelligence that the Iranians had either developed or acquired something there to cut. Now, let me just make clear, the most recent intelligence estimates I'm familiar with, but again, it's been a while since I was in government, to say the least, a long time, but less than a year. The numbers I've seen between 6, 9 or so months. It's possible that something happened that those numbers got shrunk. I don't know. And then you got the question of delivery systems. Just because you have a weapon, could you put it on a ballistic missile? If so, with what accuracy? So there's lots of gray areas of uncertainty here. I think the question is, what uncertainty are you willing to live with? Again, a historical parallel. After 9/11, Dick Cheney and others used to talk about the 1% chance. Their tolerance of uncertainty, shall we say, had gone way down. My guess is Israel's tolerance for uncertainty went down after October 7th. And I just think that's part of the psychological approach one has to, look, it's a problem in government. You never know what you don't know. And you've got to say, do you go with worst possible case analyses? In this case, that Iran was days away or weeks away from a capability. And you may say, well, I'd rather err on that side than on being too sanguine. That's a legitimate position.
Well, it seems that, right, I remember you telling me about our late friend Martin Indyck's assessment of, was it Kissinger who said that the goal is not peace, but that the goal is sort of this unstable.
Well, Henry felt that after the 73 war, if you go for peace, you would reach and not get it. And he thought what was achievable was non-belligerency and a stable status quo. And he thought by being too ambitious, you couldn't achieve what you did. And Martin came along and saying, actually, maybe we should have aimed higher. And several years later, we actually got there.
Right, and here with whether it's Hezbollah, whether it's Hamas, whether it's Iran, you're seeing a consistent picture of Israel's policy now. We're not going to live with that instability. We're going to destroy you.
Yeah, Israel has clearly has tried to change the rules of the game.
Yeah.
And has basically said, we're not going to allow you to threaten or attack us through your proxies. I think October 7th was a seminal moment in Israeli policy where the threat from proxies had crossed the line and had gone from more potential to actual. And Israel said, we're going to change the rules now. We're going to go after every one of the proxies, particularly Hezbollah and Hamas. And then we're going to go after Iran itself. And a big part of the Israeli conversation now, it reminds me of Al Haig when he was Secretary of State, it's rather than fight the war through the proxies, it's to go to the source, to go to Iran. And that's what I think we're also seeing, is that the Israelis have said, again, we're not going to leave Iran as a kind of sanctuary. So we're going to go after your proxies. We've done that. And that freed Israel up to go after Iran because it didn't have to worry about the proxies, particularly Hezbollah. And I think that's what we're seeing.
And is there something that you see Iran possibly doing? I mean, my great fear is that you back Iran in a corner and they're going to throw a punch of some magnitude that is just going to bring this to a next horrific level, whether
I'm not
that's
sure what
civilian populations, whether that is hitting other targets that Israel's just
It
going to...
seems to me they have. What are their options then? They don't have much through the proxies. Their own capabilities seem pretty limited. They could widen the war against mainly their neighbors. They could do global terrorism and all that. Those are all possible. Probably their scariest immediate option might be some version of what's called a dirty bomb. If they've got enriched uranium, they could pack enriched uranium in conventional explosives and set it off places. And though it's not a nuclear chain reaction fission, it can render a city block or two uninhabitable. So that might be the worst conceivable thing. They could do it this way. So I would say that's where deterrence comes in right now. And I would say, and, Israel's lived with that, by the way, for decades. But I would now, if I were the United States, I would be telling the Iranians, if you were to do anything like this, and you give them a list and say, or anything of this magnitude, you should know here are the consequences. And maybe, we talked with Saddam Hussein, by the way, that if he used chemical or biological, we made it clear that our goal would switch to regime change. We would attack Iraq until we brought him down. And so we could do some version of that with Iran. So that's almost the negative side. The question is also whether with those whether you can induce them. And I think that's worth trying. My view now is I would tell the president to do it in sequence or phases. I would put together a very, very demanding diplomatic outcome, backed by a credible threat of force, and give the Iranians a finite amount of time to meet it and see what happens.
All right. Last question. I feel like we're living through history, and of the various dimensions of this moment is with said fears stated, the asymmetry of this moment. Iran as the great threat. Israel has rendered that threat not out of the picture, but just air superiority. I mean, this on a strictly military level, when this moment is studied in the future in military academies, what are the shock, the asymmetry, the surprise, Israel, Iran not being able to counter it? How will this moment be understood?
This will probably be this year, it'll take 24 and 25, a seminal moment in military studies, I would think. And I'm not an expert myself, but I would think that the Ukraine war and this war and what Israel had, so the emergence of drones, highly accurate systems of all sorts, missiles and drones, interceptors with that the modern battlefield has really changed, and the incorporation of relatively inexpensive technologies have rendered large, capable, expensive weapon systems vulnerable. By the way, it has all sorts of implications for us. We've got, 15 or whatever the number is, 13 aircraft carriers. We've got a small number of very expensive aircraft, very expensive ships, in an age where you can swarm and do all sorts of things with cheap systems. So I think the common Ukraine and Israeli ingenuity and the marriage of intelligence and technology, I think is something of a revolution in warfare. And I think that's what we're seeing. And my guess is it's being studied in a hurry by Russia, by China, by the United States, because you've had two classrooms, if you will, violent classrooms right now. But I think a lot of the old thinking has been, or just particularly about force structure, I think has really changed. And the idea that you now have these highly accurate, lethal, relatively inexpensive to produce and proliferate systems. And you saw the pictures out of Tehran. You had actionable intelligence and going after individuals and so forth, and going after some of these systems. So again, it's quite impressive what can be accomplished. It doesn't allow, now, all that said, all that air power and stuff doesn't necessarily give you regime change. It's not giving you the ability to hold territory and so forth. There's still limits to what it can accomplish. But yeah, but I think you're clearly onto something, that wars of the future will look very different in some ways, at least, well, some wars of the future. You also will still have stuff that will look very hand-to-hand. Some of the wars going on around the world right now are not being fought out like this. So you could have 21st century wars and 19th century wars going on simultaneously on the planet Earth, and we probably will for some time. That's a happy note to end on.
Yeah, that's great. Come back soon. Let's pray for peace. Let's hope that spears will be turned into plowshares, and that we will arrive soon, please God, at a moment of peace. Thank you so much to Dr. Haass.
Thank you all.